Okay, another video from Norwich 93 CMP. And do the difference between the M14 housing, M1A housing, and the M1 Grand housing, and what parts are similar, or I shouldn't even say similar, the same. So, believe it or not, there are 9 parts that are the same between the M1 Grand and the M14 style trigger housings. It's the trigger retaining pin, the disconnector pin, hammer plunger, hammer spring housing, the hammer pin, and the safety, for a total of 9 parts. I'm going to go disassemble each one. Look for the other videos I have for the disassembly. I'm going to rip them down real quick, and I'm going to show you the parts. All right. All right, trigger housing to trigger housing. A lot of things are the same. Gotta get them both in the camera for you and hold them. So you got the safety boss hole, where it retains and pivots on, the trigger pin, the clover leaf. Now for the Grand, it's going to be the M block spring to eject it, and it also helps with the sear. The bottom is basically exactly the same from here back. The locations of the trigger holes, the safety holes, and the notches to lock up on the trigger guards are the same, but obviously the forward portions are totally different. One holds a magazine, the other one doesn't, just holds the bottom. On the insides, I left the M1 Grand, actually flip it over, keep the M1 Grand on the right. I left the M block spring in, but I do want to show you that there is the boss. It's in the same areas and how it sits, and there's a little shelf there. It's the same, but unlike the M1 Grand, the M14 does not extend through the hole where the spring is actually keeping it into position with that bottom piece, where the M14 just basically sits in there. Doesn't sorry about that. It goes the other way around. It just sits in there. All right. So the trigger housings basically are the same. The areas how it goes into the receiver are the same, but how it locks up is definitely different when you take a look at the trigger guards. The positioning of the locking lugs is totally different. That's one of the improvements that they made. So the boss for the locking lugs is down here and is external, and that's where we get the wear to it and how it flattens out and how it locks up on your M1 Grand, of course, with the stock and everything. But they're basically external and lower than the hammer pin hole. Well, on the M14, the locking lug is actually above, and it's this claw portion, so it's higher up into the receiver, and it's not a boss itself. It's not a pin pressed into place. It actually hooks into the receiver, and you're able to get rid of a lot of that other lower metal lightening the receiver. But we still have the boss on the inside to actually work with the excuse me, the hammer. Now this is a milled World War II version, but the later styles of the M1 Garand is very similar to this. You're supposed to be able to put a round in there and use it as like a fulcrum to pull out the tab. Everything's basically very similar again. No parts are basically the same, but there's a lot of the machining that was done from the M1 Garand is the same for this. The safeties are the same. There's no differences. You may have part numbers differences or codes that are different, but basically it is exactly the same and can be used interchangeable. So that's like the first part we came across. Oop. Hammer pins, exactly the same, no differences. Hammers, the same. Now, Winchester also made the M14, so most of the parts you see over here are Winchester, or at least USGI. The hammers are basically made the same, but the difference is this is the styles of hooks Harrison talks about in the back, where there's this cut, this little scallop. This is just a manufacturing difference. They're actually both made by Winchester, so WRA there. And the code for Winchester on M14s is 66118. But if you notice, basically the part number is the same, 46008, 46008. It's the same hammer. I wanted to show you as far as the trigger housings. So it's got the part number on it and OM. OM is Olin Manufacturing. So we got the third part is basically the same. It's the hammers. The same. No difference for the housing for the hammer springs. Springs, the same. No difference. Plungers, the same. No difference. Talked about a little bit about the trigger housing, actually the trigger guards and the trigger housings. Trigger pins, the same. Now, big differences, I shouldn't say big differences, but there could be some confusion with the triggers. The trigger itself is the same. The disconnector pin is the same, but the disconnector itself is different, and this is why. See how much thinner the M1 Garand is as compared to the M14? Well, this was made longer to work with the automatic fire of the M14. You can put the M1 Garand into the M14 trigger housing and work absolutely perfectly fine. You cannot take, I'll say it again, you cannot take the M14 trigger and put it into the M1 Garand housing. This elongated portion is wider than the cut in the wood on the stock, and you will bang it up and mar it up by trying to insert an M14 trigger in an M1 Garand trigger housing and then try to put in an M1 Garand. Don't do it. But the M1 Garand trigger will fit in the 14s. So basically, manufacturing wise, everything is exactly the same except for the disconnector. So 2 parts out of that. Those are all the parts are the same. It's amazing. You know, basically it's a baby M1 Garand. All right, folks, watch the other videos. I'm going to do some more on the M14, and probably the next one will be the rear sight. Take care.